Hi everyone, we're living through strange times at the moment. I don't think that's a surprise to hear me say that. So, in that context, it's lovely to have you with me. In this instance, for another journey into incredible places, exploring the human psyche. And along the way, it is my responsibility and my obligation to tell extraordinary stories, hopefully giving an alternative illustration of how some human beings live life and what they experience. But before we set off, let me tell you how you can support this channel. Go to patreon.com. Some of you must be sick of hearing this, but go to patreon.com, look for me by name, and sign up. It'll cost you about the price of a cup of coffee once a month. But as a member, you get early access to all my new content. You get exclusive weekly access to, amongst other things, a question and answer video where you can ask me anything. Nothing's off the table. Details, the address of the website, it's all down there. Okay, march with me now onto a battlefield of the Great War. The ghost today, well, it's called the Angel of Mons. It may be one of the most famous events in the book. You know, some of the stories or phenomena that I recount within the pages, maybe a bit obscure, and maybe not many people will have heard them before. But the Angel of Mons has been around us, well, since it happened, which is to say, right at the beginning of the First World War. I'll start with a couple of quotes that relate to, I suppose, give a sense of the way in which the phenomena is received, has been explained. The first is from the Society for Psychical Research, for there is such a body. Quote, "In the main, the result of our inquiry is negative, at least regards the question of whether any apparitions were seen on the battlefield either at Mons or elsewhere. Of first-hand testimony we have received none at all, and of testimony at second-hand we have none that would justify us in assuming the occurrence of any supernormal phenomenon." Another quote from Brigadier General John Charteris at GHQ, quote, "Then there is the story of the Angels of Mons going around the Second Corps, of how the Angel of the Lord, on the traditional white horse and clad all in white with flaming sword, faced the advancing Germans at Mons and forbade them further progress. Men's nerves and imaginations play weird pranks in these strenuous times. All the same, the Angel at Mons interests me. I cannot find how the legend arose." And finally, I just put in a quote that I've known for years. It seems to originate in the Talmud. "Every blade of grass has its angel that bends over it, whispering, 'Grow, grow.'" We've all got ideas about angels, which is to say people at least know what I mean by the word. Now, depending on your belief or the lack thereof, or your faith or the absence thereof, you have different interpretations. But, you know, there's the classical image of the angel, a sort of shining white, silver manifestation. The word angel itself, I think, really just means a messenger. You know, it's sent from God, sent from on high. But within the Christian understanding of reality and eternity, it has a very clear, instantly recognisable physical manifestation of a figure, usually clad in robes or maybe armour and with wings, great, you know, white spread feathered wings. But angels are in lots of traditions. There's something like angels within Islam, and other faiths and belief systems attest to manifestations of figures that you might describe as angels. I've got a personal connection in as much as years ago, I can't honestly, I think I was still living at home, you know, in the house in Dumfries. So you can imagine, you know, it's decades ago, but my dad told us one morning after, you know, the night had passed, that he had seen my mum's guardian angel in the bedroom. My dad died. Well, my dad was still alive when I had the idea to do this book, but he was dead by the time I'd written it and it published. So he's throughout the book. He's throughout my thinking about the book. But my dad, when I look back when I remember him, he was in certain ways an eccentric character, and in many ways he was quite straightforward and no nonsense. But he was definitely open to the other, I don't know, a bit of the woo woo. And he certainly wouldn't have described himself. He wouldn't have described himself thus. But nonetheless, I had enough conversations with him, and he said enough things over the years that I think it's fair to say that he had a sense of something strange. This thing about my mum's guardian angel, he said basically that he had woken up in the middle of the night. He didn't look at the clock or anything. It was just dark o'clock. And he had to answer a call in nature. And off he went. And then when he was on his way back to the room, having been out of the room just for a few minutes, he stopped in the doorway on his way back in, he said. And within the darkness of the bedroom, I mean, there might have been a little bit of illumination from, like a night light in the hallway, that kind of thing, or a light left on to, let people see their way to the bathroom and whatever during the night. But he was looking into the darkness, and he said that he saw a tall figure, taller than a human being, tall, like, I don't know, 8 feet tall, dark, indistinct, hooded. I suppose. I mean, I always visualise it as like a very tall monk from The Name of the Rose or something. He couldn't really see a face. It was just a shape. But it was on my mum's side of the bed, which is to say the other side of the bed from the doorway. And my dad was frozen to the spot, but he wasn't fearful at all. He said that the atmosphere in the room was, or whatever was emanating from the figure, was benevolent and caring. And he said that he just knew instantly, he knew that he was looking at my mum's guardian angel. And whatever the apparition was, it paid my dad no attention whatsoever, but it lingered in the room for some moments. My dad remembered standing for quite, it didn't just, appear and disappear. He was looking at it for quite some time, although it never acknowledged his existence. My dad didn't speak. My mum never woke up. And then it just sort of dissolved away into the surrounding darkness. Now, my dad was not making that up. He wasn't telling me something out of mischief. He definitely had that experience. Now, you could say, of course, that he had woken up from sleep, and even though he'd been up and walking around for a few minutes, that he was probably still sort of floating on the surface of sleep, a little bit befuddled maybe. And you could say that he was just he had some sort of half dream hallucination, that he wasn't fully awake. There's all sorts of ways in which you could rationally dismiss it, but it was a unique experience for my dad. He'd never had anything like it before, and he never had anything like it since, but he never forgot it. And I quite often spoke to him about it, and he always gave me the same account, and it was always very level and very undramatic. He didn't tell it as some kind of fairy story. It was just, he just described what he'd seen, and he always described it the same way. He never made any song and dance about it, and he was quite satisfied in himself that his interpretation of that experience was correct, that he had seen a presence. He had witnessed the presence of my mum's guardian angel, and I always loved it. And like I say, it was years ago. He and my mum were it's so long ago that my dad was probably more like my age now. He wasn't. So they were just in sort of middle age or advanced middle age, maybe. And I always loved the story at the time. And obviously now that both my dad died first, and then my mum relatively recently, I've thought about it more, and I like it. I like the idea. But then to get to the nub of it, the matter of the Angel of Mons, and you start unpicking it. Mons was one of the early battles of the First World War. In the late summer of 1914, before things had turned into what we think of as the First World War, before everything got bogged down in the trenches, when it was still, of uncertain shape, and, bodies of men were moving about the landscape in the way that they always had when it came to fighting, men on horseback, open engagements through the countryside, that kind of thing. In any event, on the 30th of August 1914, the Sunday Times newspaper, it was, that broke the story, if you like, of a devastating defeat that had been experienced by the British Army. It had happened a week before. It being 1914, news did not arrive on people's mobile phones even as it was happening. because there were no mobile phones. And it took time, for information to get back to the authorities and then to come through whatever censors and all of the rest of it and get it into publications. So the event was already a week old, but it described what had happened at what has become known as the Battle of Mons. The British Army had suffered a major reverse, as it was reported, almost a disaster. But somewhere within it, and not reported in the newspaper, almost certainly, is what actually happened. It was used. What had happened at Mons was used as part of a narrative. It was exploited, you might say. So there was a degree of economy with the actuality. What had certainly happened was that a large part of the British Army had found itself outnumbered and outmanoeuvred by the enemy, by the German forces. But they had, even as they were withdrawing in good order, they were kind of triggered by the French. The French began to withdraw elsewhere in the area. And because of that, the British had to go. They had to move as well. And so they began an orderly withdrawal. And at that time, the carnage not having got underway, a bulk of the fighting men were experienced professional soldiers, guys that had been around. They weren't these, raw conscripts that we're so familiar with from the idea of the hellscape of the Somme and so on. It was professional, experienced men. Among them, there was a hardcore who'd fought in the Boer War, and they knew what they were doing, and they weren't. They were in a situation where they knew they had to get themselves out of trouble, but they weren't. It wasn't anything they hadn't seen before. So they were working as professional soldiers, and they were moving and operating in a professional way. And they drew upon the lessons that they had learned from the South African experience, which is to say they were more than capable and equipped to dig in. They could find a good place in the landscape. They could exploit the shapes and the flows of the landscape, and they could dig quick trenches and foxholes and defensive positions. They knew what they were doing. So it wasn't necessarily a panicked situation, at least not to begin with. And some of these guys, they had acquired this reputation for rapid, accurate fire. So working as whole teams of men firing at the same time and firing one after the other and in sequences that were practiced and drilled. It said, although they were just using these single-action Lee Enfield rifles, the iconic weapon of the First World War on the British side, that the enemy sometimes thought they were dealing with machine gun fire because it was so rapid. The guys were so efficient in the use en masse of these weapons. So they were pulling back, along with their French allies. The Germans were advancing in almost overwhelming force. That said, on the day, and it happened on a day, they suffered around 1,600 casualties, but they inflicted, it said, 5,000 plus casualties on the Germans. So they were doing better in terms of getting off the field. But the Sunday Times story was deliberately bleak. Quote, "We have to face the fact that the British Expeditionary Force," that's the BEF, that's how the British Army was described, "which bore the great weight of the blow, has suffered terrible losses and requires immediate and immense reinforcement. It needs men, and yet more men." And so you can see with the kind of jaded, cynical eye of the 21st century, all we've learned, that the objective of the piece was less about accurately reporting what had happened and taking a handy opportunity to appeal for volunteers. It was a call for men to come forward and join up. So imagine, the story's out there, it has broken, it's been out, everyone's read it, because everybody read the newspapers in those days, and very soon thereafter, a Welsh author, a writer called Arthur Machen, wrote a short story inspired by what had happened at Mons. Admittedly inspired by what had happened at Mons, and he called it The Bowmen, as in longbow. In his fiction, his short story, he described a young British soldier at Mons, in extremis, crying out, praying to St. George, the patron saint of England, for help. And the response to the prayer was a host of phantom archers, right? Ghostly bowmen. And this force appears and it shoots hails of shining arrows towards the foe, and all the Germans fall dead, and their bodies are unmarked. They're being killed, but the weapons, the missiles, the arrows are invisible, so their bodies are untouched, although they're falling dead. And this supernatural intervention gives those British soldiers in the fiction time to get off the field, time to pull back to safety. Now, so this has happened and been inspired by the reporting of what had happened in the real world at the Battle of Mons. However, something slips out of alignment at this point. I don't know. We've mentioned time slips before in all of this, and I've speculated purely myself that something got out of step. Despite the fact that The Bowman by Machen is just a work of fiction, and it appeared for the first time in the London Evening News on the 29th of September. So a long time after, Mons was in August, people's imaginations were captured. It was an instant hit. Now that's 1914. By 1915, so by early the following year, newspapers and magazines, now remember that's the main media for popular communication. Everybody's reading. There is nothing else. So people are consuming content in newspapers and magazines, and letters are being sent. People are sending in letters over and over again. Amazing numbers, a deluge of this kind of correspondence, appearing to provide testimony from soldiers and nurses and other people involved in the war who had witnessed ghostly bowmen, a heavenly host, angels, if you like, during the real Battle of Mons. Right? So early 1915, people are writing letters to newspapers and magazines saying, I knew a guy who was at Mons and managed to survive. He told me that he saw these archers, these bowmen that intervened and gave the British soldiers time to escape. And the recurrent theme, as mentioned in the quotation at the top of the piece, was that it's never from anybody that's named. It's never from, Private so-and-so or Sergeant this or Nurse whatever. It's always just, I heard this from someone else. Sometimes it's at third hand. Sometimes it's at fourth hand. I met a guy and he knew a guy and he met a nurse and she heard from a soldier. So it's always distanced from it. There's never any actual testimony that you could stand up in a court of law, so to speak. But Arthur Machen becomes aware of this, and he seems to feel responsible for it because of his story. And he, when it comes to the publication of an anthology of his own work that was published in 1915, so some sort of collected work, he wrote an introduction. Okay. The book was called The Bowman and Other Legends of the War. And in the introduction, he made clear that the Bowman was just fantasy, written after the Battle of Mons had happened. But to no avail. In fact, it probably even made things worse. The belief in the angel, this divine intervention at the Battle of Mons, had taken root and would not be erased. And it's with us to this day. And to the end of his days, Machen would tell anybody that would listen that the Bowman was only a product of his imagination. However, a British population in need of hope, and that's really where you start to get to the heart of the matter. People only just beginning to deal with the budding enormity of what we know as the First World War. And in the early days of it, the British Expeditionary Force had this major reversal, this defeat, a near disaster, narrowly averted. And people in that anxiety didn't want to let facts get in the way of a good story, as we say. And so forever after, the idea of angelic, ghostly defenders appearing in the hour of need at Mons still has it. You'll still meet people now. I've met them. I've done lots of stuff about the First World War, and I've met veterans. I did meet veterans when they were still veterans, still alive. But I know the descendants of veterans, and more than one of them has told me that their grandfather or their great grandfather or whatever saw the Angel of Mons. And I think about it in terms of like an oyster, a pearl growing in an oyster. That if you think of Arthur Machen's story as a wee bit of grit in that's in the body politic, and like an oyster lays down nacre around the grit to protect itself from harm from this sharp thing, thus a pearl grows. And that's how I think about it. I think about this translucent, opalescent, luminous formation around the Battle of Mons, around the truth of it. I think about it as the inadvertent creation of a jewel, a precious stone in the face of horror. And in a way that often happens, Machen's story no longer belonged to him. It had been taken by the people, and they made it their own because they needed it. There was a collective need, and whether he meant to or not, his story helped answer that need. Now, to get to the testimony, so-called, one after another report where Machen's story was about a body of archers, hundreds of ghostly bone. As the thing went on, more than one eyewitness after another attested to seeing a classic angel on a white horse, wielding a blazing sword with flames, licking down the blade, and so on and so on. Many times life size, 20 feet tall, 50 feet tall, all sorts of it. And like I said, it all grew arms and legs. Other people reported multiple horsemen on whole cavalries of phantom horses with white knights on the back of them, escorting bodies of British soldiers to safety and standing in the way of advancing Germans and making their weapons harmless and all. It just grows and grows and grows. William George Ludlow was a teenager at the Battle of Mons, and I'm saying that there was no testimony at the time, so the stuff that was making its way into the newspapers and magazines was always second-hand, third-hand. But many, many years later, as I say, veterans began saying, well, actually, when you come to mention it, and William George Ludlow became one of the people that's associated with this. He was a teenager at the Battle of Mons, and long after the war, he started telling his children and then his grandchildren that he had seen this beautiful angel, a single figure, single-handedly galling the advance. He said he saw it. And he's not alone. And there was an anonymous letter to the Bath Society paper in 1915 that was typical, in that it described angels familiar to those who've had a traditional Christian upbringing. Okay? Now, to quote the letter in the Bath Society paper, I myself saw the angels who saved our left wing from the Germans during the retreat from Mons. We heard the German cavalry tearing after us and ran for a place where we thought a stand could be made. We saw between us and the enemy a whole troop of angels. So a recurrent theme had the manifestation, whatever. I mentioned a pearl. So over and over again, there's testimony of whatever they can see, archers, horses, angels, they're wrapped up in a glowing opalescence, a cloud that makes them indistinct. It's bright and it glows. And that's a feature. Now, whether it spreads by a sort of a contagion or whether it's speaking to something that people actually experienced, well, who can say now? And I thought about it at the time, this idea of a cloud of safety, or a cloud bringing life and salvation. It struck me as a strange inversion occurred, because in 1915, on the 22nd of April 1915, to be precise, there was the first use of poison gas at Ypres. And at 5 p.m. on the afternoon, in that location of Ypres, cylinders, metal cylinders, which had been pre-buried in shallow graves by specialist German technicians, began opening and releasing the poison gas within. And what rose was this greenish yellow fog, the mustard gas, so-called, that drifted on the wind, and it drifted into trenches that were occupied, as it happened, by French soldiers, colonial recruits from Algeria, in fact. It was chlorine gas, desperately toxic, and a British officer saw at some remove what was happening. Quote, a panic-stricken rabble of Turcos and Zouaves with grey faces and protruding eyeballs, clutching their throats and choking as they ran, many of them dropping in their tracks and lying on the sodden earth while limbs convulsed and features distorted in death. So it's this, you talk about, when you get into this kind of material, you talk about synchronicities, in that when you sort of open up to one idea, you seem to find or even be given other seemingly connected ideas, and I do think there's something interesting in this idea of people on the one hand seeing a mist that protects. I find it's interesting that it's happening at the same time as we definitely know that elsewhere and slightly later on there were these mists of death, bringing death. So all of it's conspiring to build the horror of the First World War as time begins to pass. There's a terrible reality starts to take shape. And back home, you've got a British population who don't really know what's going on, and no generation has ever experienced what they are about to experience. So there's this terrible uncertainty. All they know is that their fathers and their sons and their husbands and their brothers and whatever are out there, and they don't really know what's happening to them, but they just know that things are starting to get worse. And they're desperate. That population's desperate to hear anything. And news, personal news, actual information from your loved one is almost impossible to get. It's very difficult to get hold of. You're waiting on occasional letters. And so remember that in 1914, you've got a sort of a post-Edwardian population who in large part are people of faith. They're church going, they're raised in the church, and they're ready, they're desperate for any suggestion that God is on their side, and protecting their loved ones in the face of the enemy. And that's the crucible in which the legend of the Angel of Mons manifests an anxious, desperate population who don't have much in the way of information they feel that they can rely on, and into that vacuum, into that void is pulled, well, whatever other ideas are invited. So whatever did or didn't happen at Mons in August in 1914, it was certainly not the first time that men in extremis had claimed or believed that they'd been saved by something mysterious. George Washington, first president of the United States of America, he wrote about how his actions at Valley Forge between December 1777 and June 1778 were directed by angels. He claimed divine intervention. And in the aftermath of Shiloh, which was one of the iconic battles of the American Civil War, 6th to 7th April 1862, soldiers who survived said that they were subsequently guided to the locations of injured men by shining clouds. These silvery clouds appeared and moved slowly across the landscape, and if they followed them, they were led to wounded men. So there's recurrences of phenomena. And so, it having captured the attention of this, Edwardian public in the early stages of war, the Angel of Mons never let go, never went away again. The embers of it, if you like, were always there, warm, hot enough that an exhalation or a gust of fresh oxygen would whip the whole thing back up into life. And down through the decades since the First World War, one thing after another has occasioned a return of interest in the Angel of Mons. And an example of that came in 1999 when a photograph surfaced, if you like, in a Welsh antique shop. An author from Stroud called Danny Sullivan went to the newspapers and said that he'd gone into an antique shop in a Welsh town, and he'd found a canister of film and other items in a shop called Bonita's Antique Shop in Agincourt Square in Monmouth. And he told he told a journalist at the Sunday Times, right, so the same newspaper but a different iteration of it many decades later, he said that he had, along with a canister of film, there were letters, other documents, and that the film in the canister had been shot by a veteran from the Battle of Mons called William Dodge from Monmouth, right? And having seen the ghostly soldiers during the battle while serving with the Scots Guards, this William Dodge had become obsessed with the paranormal. And in an added twist, according to this guy Danny Sullivan, Dodge had written about how he had fallen in love during the war with a local girl, a local French girl. And he'd lost contact with her when he was repatriated, and then he'd spent years convinced that the Angel of Mons would reunite them, that this continuing divine presence would help him even after the war was over. And in 1952, William Dodge, according to Danny Sullivan, William Dodge's path crossed with that of an American First World War veteran, right? So a fellow combatant, but from the American side, who was identified, who Dodge only identified as Doug, just a first name. And Doug had his own story to tell, which William Dodge had recorded. So it's all coming from this guy, Danny Sullivan. Bear with me, you can re-listen to this. The chronology and the sequence of events, it's slightly confusing here, but don't worry about it too much. The point is that according to Danny Sullivan, who went to the Sunday Times in 1999, this American told Dodge about a tragedy he subsequently heard about that had befallen American soldiers training for D-Day. D-Day at the end of the Second World War in Woodchester Park, which is the grounds of a house, a Gothic revival pile near Nymphsfield in Gloucestershire, right? So that these places were taken over routinely so that men could train and men could be brought together and drilled and all of the rest of it. And as part of their practice, part of their drilling, there was a pontoon bridge across a lake that they were training on, and it collapsed during a drill and men were crushed and drowned. So this tragedy had unfolded. And according to the testimony that came to Danny Sullivan via this American soldier, Doug, an angel, much like that reported at Mons, had been seen hovering over the lake the day before the accident. This is decades later. This is decades after Mons. This is during the Second World War. But something similar apparently had happened in this location. An angel had appeared as though forewarning of disaster. So, along with the canister of film and the paperwork that had been collected by Dodge, there was a black and white photograph of the angel seen over the lake in the grounds of the stately home, while the American GIs were training for D-Day. So the rest of the world's media. This having broken in the Sunday Times, everybody else wants a piece of it. And Sullivan, emboldened by it all, said that he'd sold the film, the canister of film, and the story to an American film director called Tony Kaye. Now, amongst other things, Tony Kaye's a real person, a real film director. He directed, amongst other things, American History X, for those of you that are interested. And he said, so Sullivan says that he sold the whole thing, the story about Dodge and Doug and the angel in the grounds of the stately home. He sold all of this to Tony Kaye for $500,000. And he says that Marlon Brando has been signed to play the part of Dodge in a blockbuster Hollywood movie. And so a piece is published in the Guardian newspaper on the 13th of March 2001, right? This is a couple of years after his story first broke, and it said that this epic would be like a combination of Titanic, the Kate Winslet DiCaprio movie, with the Blair Witch Project, right? It would have the supernatural of the Blair Witch Project, and it would have all the drama and the doomed love affair of Titanic. And Tony Kaye, the film director, he says, he's quoted saying that the contents of the canister, this is the closest we have on film to proof of an angel. I've spent much of my life looking at special visual effects, and this is an effect for which I have no explanation. right? The whole thing's murky and uncertain. What are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with the Angel of Mons? Are we dealing with this? Are we dealing with the angel from the Second World War? So far, so supernatural. Until 2002, when an investigative reporter called Chris Morris, working for BBC Wales, he digs the whole thing up again, makes some calls, follows up some leads, and finds that the whole thing is a hoax. Everything. From Sullivan, this guy Sullivan had concocted the story about William Dodge, Doug the American GI, the angel at the lake, the existence of the film, all the documents. He'd whipped the whole thing up from nowhere. It was a scam, by means of which he hoped to draw attention to a book that he'd written a decade before about another haunted house. Right? He was just trying to attract attention to himself, so that in the flow of all the excitement, people would be drawn to something else that he had written. And Tony Kaye, the film director, had been in on the ruse as well. Right? The whole thing was just a hoax that made it all the way to British national newspapers and media elsewhere. So this does not help our cause, because people say, "Oh well, this is all these things are just made up." This hoax just underlines that everything to do with this kind of story is a fiction. It just comes from people's imagination, and there's always a reason why they want to come up with these stories. But the Angel of Mons persists. There are innumerable books about the Angel of Mons. There are those that keep faith with the legend. There are those that take the line of Arthur Machen that the whole thing was just a fiction. It was just some kind of sort of collective delusion that was understandable given the state of mind of so many people at the time. The William Dodge hoax, that's the sort of shorthand way of describing this thing that Danny Sullivan whipped up. The William Dodge hoax, notwithstanding, the legend of the Angel of Mons is referenced over and over. You find it in books. You find it referred to in movies. It crops up. It's handed from generation to generation. And the whole thing's become muddled. The separation between imagination, the separation between imagination and reality is never made clear. But the notion of divine intervention by shining figures wrapped in light is old. It's older than the First World War. And it happens before the First World War, it happens during the First World War, and it continues to give service ever after. If you do an online search for Padre Pio, you will be confronted with a deluge of entries that detail miracles attributed by the Catholic faithful to a Capuchin friar and priest called Padre Pio, who's famed for the wounds of Christ. He had stigmata, the wounds of the nails in his hands. These things opened up in his hands and never healed. And he had these stigmata for most of his life, and he became a living saint. He was venerated by the faithful. And in amongst all of the stuff about Padre Pio, you'll find multiple sites that describe that when US bombers were sent on their missions during World War II anywhere near San Giovanni Rotondo, which was Padre Pio's hometown, that they were diverted, they were turned back by the appearance in the sky of a giant shining image of Padre Pio, dead ahead, this huge, many times life size, with his arms outstretched in the universal gesture of peace. Now, you can think I'm making this up, or you can think that everyone's making it up, but there's an awful lot of testimony to it. So the Washington Post, as recently as November 1983, carried a book review about Padre Pio by an English author called Suzanne St Albans. Now, and the journalist of the piece, the Washington Post journalist, was Phil McCombs, and he included mention of the miracle of the bombers in his review, in the story that he published. Quote, during the Second World War, according to Father Joseph, who had been the Padre's top aide, American bombers frequently flew in this direction. But it happened more than once that pilots disobeyed their orders and returned to base without having rid themselves of their load. World War the reason given in the records is the vision of a monk standing in the sky and boys is easy enough to understand. So, and the first soldiers who took part in the first set-piece grand battle were ready to be persuaded of a miracle. Well, you can forgive that as well in the timing of the First World War. And it came early. As I've already mentioned, it came early in the war, before the advent of the trenches and the machine guns and the barbed wire and the wholesale meat grinding carnage. It was in that relatively early part of the war. And I think that's critical. I think that time in which the legend of the Angel of Mons was born, I think the timing of it is critical. It comes at that point when people are anxious, they're not confronted by the reality, and they're pulled by hope and despair. You know, there are millions of people simultaneously are hanging in that limbo. And elsewhere, I've written about Rupert Brooke, that epitome of English boyhood, manhood, beautiful hero. I've written about how he died before the full horror of the First World War. He only lived to see the opening moves. And by dying when he did, in the circumstances in which he died, he preserved innocence, not just his own, untouched by the horror, but innocence itself. It's like a bug trapped in amber, Jurassic Park style. It's just there. That innocence which died with him and died forever. The innocence of which we were divested as a species by the First World War. We will never be innocent in that way again. That possibility imploded. But there's something of it preserved in the memory of someone like Rupert Brooke. And when he died, he still had the almost understandable young man's appetite for war, of the sort that men of his class and men of his time picked up from Homer and the Iliad and so on, and the Odyssey. He had this idea in his head of, clean-limbed heroes, light-foot lads. The quotation from some of his early work is, "To turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary." As swimmers into cleanness leaping. His naivety is painful to look at, but that was the vision of fighting that he had, that all these the young men of his generation who were just lolling about, lost in their studies at in Oxford and Cambridge, would be sort of awoken from their slumber, their dusty slumber, and they would dive like swimmers into cleanness by taking part in what he imagined the First World War was going to be. On the contrary, the soldiers at Mons may have caught a glimpse of the future. They may have sensed that something bigger was coming. And yet they're there in that limbo as well, where there's still room for hope, shining hope in their hearts and in their minds. And when you contemplate those unviolated minds, unviolated by the horror of the 20th century as we came to know it, that in that place of innocence and naivety, let's say, you could conceive of shining angels, ghostly bowmen sent by St. George. You can allow that there were still generations of men, of people, who were able to make space in their imaginations for ideas like that, because they hadn't learned the cynicism, the irony that was bludgeoned onto them by what happened in 1916 and 1917 and 1918. Brooke, for all his innocence, had a premonition, it would appear, of what was to come. He was aboard his ship en route to Gallipoli. That's when he died of blood poisoning. But in the days before he died, he wrote, or he made notes, quote, pride in their strength and in the weight and firmness and linked beauty of bodies and pity. This gay machine of splendour soon to be broken, thought little of, pashed, scattered, like coloured shadows, thinner than filmy glass. Perishing things and strange ghosts soon to die, to other ghosts, this one or that or I. The enormity of the First World War was coming. I mentioned the idea of like time slip and things getting out of order. But I allow for the possibility that the enormity of what was coming, Ypres, Arras, the Somme, Passchendaele, it exerted a foreshadowing. Even before these events unfolded, there was something of them that was palpable, that was coming. But at Mons, early enough, the presentiment of all of it might have loomed in the minds of experienced fighting men. Those men of the British Expeditionary Force that I mentioned that were veterans of the Boer War and other things. They had seen enough and knew enough that possibly as they read the landscape and fought for their lives and did what soldiers do, they nonetheless sensed that something else was coming. They were running ahead of it. They were running ahead of the future, but the future was coming. And it was summoning collectively an atmosphere. I mean, as the war played out, it all became about survival. That was the most that you could hope for. But by 16 and 17 and 18, there was no room for fantasies. There was no room for, nobody was any longer, putting faith in the mud of the Western Front, in the idea of being saved by angels. There were no King Arthurs, there were no St. Georges, there were no bowmen of Agincourt coming to save them. And yet, for all that, the story lingered, like a fire that goes underground in a seam of coal. The fire goes out, but the heat's still there, and from time to time, it breaks out. And there are those among us now, even in the 21st century, after all that cynicism, after all that irony, that still hanker for ancient salvation. I mean, much later, Machen said remarked about the indomitability of the effect of his fiction. He said, "It was as if I had touched the button and set in action a terrific, complicated mechanism of rumours that pretended to be sworn truth, of gossip that posed as evidence, of wild taradiddles that good men most firmly believed." It's not for nothing that the Angel of Mons is one of the most famous ghost stories. And it's not for nothing, and it's not inexplicable that legend perseveres, that people need it and want it. Because it's a recurrent phenomenon that people in extremis are capable of generating something. If you remember during the pandemic, Matthias Desmet, who's an academic, he attracted some attention by this idea of mass formation psychosis that he described, and he said that it was explicable that where you have a population sharing anxiety, that the anxiety is free floating. It's just there, like bad weather, ready to come, and it's channeled by something. And so you had an anxious population, and then when they were presented with and told that they were in a pandemic, that gave a shape, something coherent to what had otherwise been this free floating anxiety. And so you've got, during the First World War, you had people desperately anxious all at the same time, millions of them. And it's not inconceivable that their stress would manifest as something tangible. There's lots of literature about a phenomena called the egregore. And the egregore is a where you get a group of people, not necessarily a huge group of people, but where you get a group of people and they are sharing an idea. That idea, they are actually, there's thinking that they're capable of summoning a manifestation of their collective intention. Now that's the egregore. And the egregore, believe it or believe it not, takes on a form of its own and becomes a semi or an independent entity that can think and act for itself. I mean, you might talk about a big corporation, a big like Apple, or Microsoft, that all those people together, working together, sharing an intention, sharing a thought, that there's a Microsoft egregore, that there's an Apple egregore, and it's real. But depending on what you mean by real, but the people thinking like that can collectively summon something into being. During in the aftermath of the 6-Day War, the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, Well, in 1968, that war, the Six-Day War, was in 1967. In 1968, from the spring onwards, a phenomenon occurred in the Zaytun suburb of Cairo. It started small. A couple of people reported that they had seen on a rooftop in this suburb of Cairo a manifestation, a glowing manifestation of the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. And after their testimony, well, it grew like topsy. And eventually, believe it or believe it not, the testimony is there, it's on the record. Eventually, hundreds of thousands of people had seen or claimed to have seen the Virgin on a rooftop in this suburb of Cairo. I mean, by some estimates, it might even be millions of people, because the sightings, it's what's called a Marian apparition, an apparition of Mary. It went on for years. I think 3 years, actually. So from 1968 to 1971, busloads of people were turning up in Zaytun in expectation of seeing this. And all sorts of people, Nasser said that he had seen the Virgin Mary. All sorts of people gave testimony about it. Now, you can say it's mass hysteria. You can call it anything you like. You can cite Matthias Desmond's mass formation psychosis. But think about the context in which it was happening. In 1967, the Arab population of the Middle East had been absolutely devastated by the defeat in that war. They couldn't believe it. It was shattering what was inflicted upon their forces by the Israeli forces in that very short encounter. So all at once, you've got an entire population who can't believe what's happened to it. So there's all this stress. And and within that wider population, you've got the Coptic Christian population of Egypt, and so there would be the explanation why the apparition would take the form that it did, which is to say a classic visualization of the Mother of Jesus Christ. But imagine you've got millions of people, millions of people in the First World War, millions of people sharing the same anxiety, manifestations thereof. Well, then, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, you've got millions of people all at the same time who can't believe what's happened to their sense of themselves. And what happens? You get this mass experience of an apparition. All say they're seeing the same things. And it's millions of people, arguably. It's certainly hundreds of thousands of people that eventually said that they too had seen the Virgin Mary. So, what is reality? What is reality? Is real the things that you can touch, the things that are solid, that can be perceived with your five senses? Or, as Plato suggests, is real actually what's in a transcendent realm that we cannot touch, see, smell, taste, hear? The real things are in that realm that we don't get to touch, and that all that we have in our manifesting as matter, manifesting as solid, are poor reproductions of the ideal that actually exists somewhere else. So what is real? What is real? That's really the question. And the ancients, including among them the smartest of the ancients, considered imagination to be powerful and to be real, and that the manifestations from imagination were real. Lots of people, scientists and people credited with all sorts of creativity and inventions, will attest to the idea that their achievements kind of came into them from the outside, that they weren't theirs. They didn't write the song or make the painting or create the sculpture, that it came to them because their imagination had tapped into something. This heightened state of consciousness that they had briefly been in enabled them to channel something else. And there's simply too much testimony like this to be dismissed. And so again, I suggest that there are conversations that need to be had to let people properly describe and be listened to when they offer up this kind of testimony. I mean, my dad's dad, he of the Guardian Angel, my dad's dad was Robert Miller Oliver, and he was at the Somme, and he was at Passchendaele, and he lived, obviously, or I wouldn't be sitting here now. Well, he lived not to tell the tale, as it turned out, because unlike the figures that came back with diaries or they subsequently wrote accounts of what they had seen. My grandpa never did. Whatever he did, whatever happened to him, he never spoke about it. As far as we can tell, he didn't tell anyone. But he was affected. Okay, he was there, and I dread to think what he saw. I even dread to think possibly what he did. I don't know, but he was in those terrible places, and he was part of those terrible events, and so he carried something ever after. I mean, apart from the shrapnel wounds and everything else that was physical, his personality would have been, by my dad's testimony, was affected by what he had been through in the First World War. He was, he was a different man than he would have been if he hadn't gone through that. And so that's epigenetics. It's where you get the characteristics that are in your DNA, but there are experiences that a person can endure in life that create epigenetic mutations, I suppose, or alterations of them. And believe it or believe it not, those epigenetic characteristics, some of them are inheritable. They can be passed. They can be passed down. If you have a child that's denied love, it doesn't even have to be like physically or emotionally abused directly. If you just have a child who is denied affection and denied love, from infancy till they're 3, 4, 5 years old, there are switches, if you like, in their consciousness or in their cognition, in their brain, that they were born with them on. A baby is born ready to be loved. A baby is born ready to experience affection. And if they don't get that affection and that love, those switches in the on position switch off. Right? So they went from being receivers of love, potential receivers of it, to being incapable of receiving it. The switch goes off. And believe it or believe it not, psychologists say that person, that woman, let's say, having had her switches switched off, if she has a child, she has a little girl, whatever, that child is born with its switches off. She should be born with the switches in the on position, ready to receive, ready to be loved. But the baby born to the damaged person, the switches are off now, and that sets up that's a cascading effect. Unless there's an intervention, and you can intervene if it's identified, and the switches can be turned back on again, and then the successive generations will be born with their switches on. But if there's no intervention, you've got a line of people that are just producing people with the switches switched off, right? So, I mean, that's a kind of clumsy, I suppose, probably incomplete description of epigenetics. But what I'm saying is that I've wondered, in the context of my dad and his dad, if something that happened, if my grandfather had his psychology altered in some way by what he saw between 1916 and 1918, and then went on to have my dad, I wonder if some of the characteristics that had been created in my grandfather were passed to my dad, is what I'm saying. And so I think about that. I think about what altered awareness he may have inherited. And then I think about him that night when, for a moment, as he said, he thought he saw my mother's guardian angel. I make space for that having been a real experience for my dad. And I wonder if it wasn't, when you get right down to it, I wonder if that guardian angel, I wonder if it wasn't a gloomy premonition that my dad was having, that he would die first and leave my mum behind, which he did, which is what happened. I wonder if my dad was seeing that ahead of time, that he would die first and leave my mum behind. And that with that thought in his head, befuddled by sleep, I wonder if it was himself that he saw, watching over my mum while she slept, completely unaware that he was there. And I'll leave it at that.